Sintopia might seem like just a stylish city builder at first glance, but the game changes completely once you understand how hell and the world of the living feed off each other. The secret isn't just expanding, it's avoiding bottlenecks, manipulating the flow of souls, and making your infernal operation run exactly the right way. So if you want to play much better and stop making mistakes in things the game barely explains, today I'm bringing you 10 advanced tips I learned by failing a lot. But I'm going to save you that time. I'm Matthew, and the video is about to start. One of the strongest insights I've had in Sintopia is that the problem isn't just the soul's destination, but the path it takes to get there. Many people only think about separating the sectors of hell properly, but they forget that every step counts because the soul accumulates sin simply by walking. When I understood this, my way of building the city changed completely. Instead of just thinking about space efficiency, I started thinking about path control. That's where the idea of an optimized conveyor belt of salvation comes in. I like to set up one-way roads to guide souls through a well-calculated route, without unnecessary intersections and without that flow mess that slows everything down. The secret is to let the path yield as much as possible and place the Omniscient Doctor exactly at the end, as if it were the final stage of an industrial cleaning process. In practice, you let the soul absorb all the corruption from the path and only remove it once it has already delivered enough value to the system. The most interesting part is that this tip gets even better when you stop thinking of it as a hallway and start seeing it as a circuit. When I started playing with loops and soul dispatchers, things leveled up because you can force multiple passes and extract even more from this controlled accumulation of sin. It's almost like creating an infernal production line, where every lap was planned to increase yield before the final purification. If set up well, the system feels half cruel, half elegant, and that's exactly why it works so well within the game's logic. What I really like about this strategy is that it seems advanced, but deep down it stems from a simple observation. In Sintopia, movement is also a resource. This totally changes how I evaluate layout, distance, and building placement. Instead of just trying to shorten the path, it's often more worthwhile to lengthen the route intelligently and control where the cleaning happens. When you adopt this mindset, hell stops being just a functional city and starts becoming a much more precise machine. Turning a soul into a hero doesn't just depend on almost cleaning its sin. In practice, you need to treat this process with a safety buffer because the game is cruel with the details. Since the soul still accumulates sin while walking to the resurrection portal, it's no use leaving it at 49 and thinking everything is settled. This is exactly the kind of mistake that seems small but destroys an important conversion at the last moment. Because of this, I started always aiming for 40 or less. And honestly, I think this is the kind of habit that separates improvised management from truly efficient management. This number acts as strategic slack, a real safety buffer, to ensure the soul still arrives viable at its destination even after the final trek. I like this tip because it doesn't depend on luck or quick reactions, only on planning. You stop playing on the edge and start setting up your operation with an intelligent margin. What's most interesting is how this completely changes the way I look at the city layout. It's not enough to think only about the purification itself, because the distance to the portal also enters the equation. So when I'm organizing the base, I already consider that a soul that is theoretically ready can still lose its way for a few extra steps. It's one of those situations where the journey matters almost as much as the treatment, and ignoring this is costly when you're trying to unlock new technologies. In the end, I see this tip as an experienced player's mindset. Never work at the exact limit when the system can still charge you during the final displacement. In Sintopia, 50 isn't your real goal, it's the ceiling you can't touch. The real goal is 40 or less, specifically to absorb that last layer of sin without ruining everything. Once I started thinking like this, my hero conversions became much more consistent and far less frustrating. In the beginning, I saw demonic corruption as a disaster I needed to avoid at all costs. But after playing more, it became clear to me that Sintopia loves turning problems into opportunities. When a soul's sin goes way over the limit and it enters this more chaotic route, it doesn't just mean your management failed. In many cases, it means you are facing a rare resource that can be exploited intelligently. The most important point here is understanding the escalation. When a sin category passes 50, that soul enters a dangerous zone, and if that value reaches 100, it turns into a demon in the overworld. The most obvious reaction is to think things went wrong. But I like the fact that the game lets you respond strategically. If you defeat that demon, you can recruit it using heroes as a special employee. And that's where things get really interesting. The reason this is so strong is that these special workers aren't just a consolation prize. They can bring unique bonuses that change the yield of your operation. So that soul that seemed like a complete mistake might end up becoming a valuable piece of your infernal machine. And if recruitment doesn't make sense at that moment, there's still the option to banish it for a reward. I really like this logic because it gives weight to your decisions and makes the chaos feel calculable, especially when you're already thinking about long-term efficiency. To me, this is one of the most devious late-game strategies because it shifts your mindset from control to exploitation. Instead of trying to prevent all extreme corruption, you start choosing which cases are worth letting escalate to farm demons on purpose. It's almost like creating a parallel economy based on controlled crises. When I realized this, Sintopia became much more interesting because the game stopped being just about putting out fires and started being about deciding which fires are worth letting burn. Many people look at hiring as if it were a simple salary spreadsheet, but I think that's one of the easiest mistakes to make in the game. After a while, it becomes very clear to me that an employee's real value isn't just in the immediate cost, but in the effect they have on the entire flow of the operation. Sometimes, a slightly more expensive employee is much more worth it, just for having a trait that speeds up souls, holds back future costs, or improves the overall efficiency of hell without drawing much attention. An example I've come to value greatly are traits that increase fear in souls, like creepy. This seems like a detail when you first see it, but in practice, it makes a real difference because souls with more fear walk faster, and if they walk faster, they spend less time accumulating passive corruption on the way. I really like this logic because it shows how Sintopia rewards those who think in systems, not just in dry payroll numbers. Traits that reduce automatic salary increases are also absurdly strong, especially when the game is further along and your structure starts getting too expensive to maintain on the fly. In the early game, you can even ignore this and just hire based on the base value, but in the late game, this mindset takes a high toll. I already think this type of trait is worth its weight in gold precisely because it protects your economy in the long run, and that ends up giving you more freedom to invest in buildings, layout adjustments, and truly special employees. To me, this is one of those tips that separate the average manager from the player who truly understood Sintopia. Those who look only at salary are trying to erase immediate costs. Those who look at synergy are building a smarter operation where speed, fear, passive corruption, and cost scaling work together. After I started filtering employees this way, my hiring decisions became much less obvious, but much more efficient. When I started to understand how the economy really works, one of the first things that caught my attention was the potential of impish resources as a financial reserve. Most players use this resource quite casually, but when you start accumulating around 8 units early on, you are essentially creating a solid foundation before maintenance costs start to weigh you down. I really like this type of strategy that requires early planning because it rewards those who think a few steps ahead instead of just reacting to what's happening. What transforms this from a good strategy into an absurd combo is Mammon's unparalleled tax expert perk. On its own, accumulating impish resources already helps a lot, but when you combine that stockpile with this specific perk, the game's logic turns upside down in a very satisfying way. What used to be upkeep, that constant cost that eats away at your budget as you expand, begins to function as a source of net profit. This means that growing becomes financially advantageous instead of just expensive. What I find most elegant about this build is that it doesn't depend on exploiting some bug or obscure mechanic. It works because Sintopia was designed with layers of synergy, and this particular combination is one of the strongest precisely because it attacks the most frustrating problem of the mid and late game: maintaining a large operation without sinking into fixed expenses. When you turn maintenance into profit, scaling stops being a risk and becomes a real competitive advantage. To me, this is the kind of combo I like to test in the very first hours of a new save because it sets the pace for everything that follows. With the economy stabilized like this, you have the freedom to experiment with bolder builds, invest in special recruitment, and risk strategies that would normally be too expensive. It's basically an economic foundation that makes the rest of the game feel more manageable, and once you try it once, it's hard to play any other way. One of the biggest mistakes I see many people making in Sintopia is staying in an observer position, just waiting for the hummus to sin naturally. I used to spend a lot of time looking at the overworld myself, hoping those little creatures would commit exactly the offenses my machines downstairs needed. But depending on the goodwill or the game's artificial intelligence, to generate resources is a trap. It only creates bottlenecks in your operation and leaves your expensive infrastructure sitting idle, which is a nightmare in any management game. That's exactly why Force Push stopped being just any spell and became my primary tool for dictating the pace of the match. Whether using the radial version to spread chaos in an area, or the directional one for more surgical control, I spend all my time literally pushing the hummus into temptations. You don't have to wait for them to find the opportunity to sin. You force the mistake to happen at the time and place that is most convenient for your strategy. The great secret of this tactic is the perfect alignment between what happens on the surface and what your hell can process. If I've just expanded and optimized an entire sector to deal with a specific sin, I can't afford to receive souls with other infractions. So I look at the map, locate the targets, and use the push to throw the hummus exactly into the situations that will generate the raw material my factory is hungry to swallow. When you adopt this more aggressive posture, maximizing flow by force, your economy takes off in a terrifying way. The game stops being a passive wait and transforms into a production line where you have absolute control over demand. It's a very good feeling of mastering the mechanics, because every push you give up there translates into perfect efficiency and zero waste down below. I've lost some ridiculous games simply by forgetting the most basic rule of survival in the game. We get so caught up in optimizing production lines in hell, calculating salaries and converting souls, that we end up taking our eyes off what really matters: the temple in the overworld. If the seeding temple falls, it doesn't matter how rich your economy is, it's game over instantly, everything you built disappears in a flash, and the feeling of frustration is massive. The game is very treacherous in this sense because it demands so much of your attention underground while the real threat grows silently on the surface. Demon attacks and disasters generated by the accumulation of sins show no mercy to your perfect infrastructure. When an invasion focuses on your temple, the damage is absurdly fast and lethal. I had to swallow some painful defeats to understand that there's no point in being the best manager in hell if your front door is completely vulnerable. Today, my golden rule for any campaign or high-tension challenge is to treat temple defense as an absolute priority. I never leave my defensive spells uncharged, no matter the cost. The threat meter in the overworld has become the first place I look at each cycle, ensuring I always have an immediate response ready to be used. This continuous preparation is exactly what saves your skin when the game decides to test your limits with an aggressive wave of enemies. Shifting this posture completely transforms your experience as a player. You stop focusing on just one map and become a true manager of two worlds simultaneously, balancing the factory's greed with the paranoia of defense. Keeping the temple standing stops being a secondary task and becomes the armored foundation that allows all your other strategies to work in peace. After all, the best soul processing line in the world is worth absolutely nothing if the heart of your empire is destroyed. When we start playing, our natural instinct is to look at the hummus just as fuel for our underworld empire. We want to corrupt, punish, and profit as quickly as possible. But it took me a few hours of gameplay to realize that this short-term mentality is a huge trap. If you focus only on extracting souls without caring about where they come from, your raw material will dry up very quickly. That's when I understood that the true secret to scaling in the game lies in mastering the life cycle of these little creatures on the surface. Their growth dynamics are very interesting. Every dawn, new hummus are born in the overworld, but they have very clear needs to expand their own village. For their city to thrive, they need to build basic structures like farms and sawmills. If their settlement stays stagnant because they lack basic resources, your production in hell will also stagnate. I began to see the surface not just as a target for spreading chaos, but as an investment that needs to be carefully cultivated. The big secret to this strategy is how you decide to help this civilization grow. The most common mistake is spending your mana desperately trying to solve all the hummus's problems and acting like a goody two-shoes guardian. The masterstroke I apply in my campaigns is offering entirely indirect and calculated help. You only need to ensure the environment is favorable enough for them to survive and build these structures themselves without compromising the economy of your own base in the process. Ultimately, using this tactic completely changes the scale of your operation. I started treating the hummus village much more coldly, viewing that population as my customer base. Helping the city prosper indirectly is by far the smartest way to ensure a constant and massive flow of souls to process later on. When you find the perfect balance between letting their civilization grow and reaping the profits at the right time, your hell will never stop for lack of workers. In almost every management game, our natural instinct is to seek absolute perfection in everything we do. When I started playing Sintopia, I was sure that totally cleaning a soul's sin was the ultimate goal. After all, turning it into a saint seemed like the supreme victory of your purification system. But I discovered the hard way that being an impeccable manager in this case is actually a huge trap for your long-term economy. The mechanic works in a very ironic and punishing way. When you resurrect a soul with an almost zeroed sin level, it becomes a saint and earns you those valuable resources to unlock new research and technologies. The problem starts in that person's next life cycle. This saint returns to the overworld and simply stops committing offenses. Suddenly, you look at your expensive infrastructure in hell and realize the machines are idle because your main raw material has simply dried up. That's when I had to completely change my mindset and start looking at this population in a slightly more corporate and cruel way. I started treating the inhabitants as recurring customers, and a customer who doesn't sin anymore is a terrible business for the underworld. The real challenge of the game is maintaining a base of souls that I like to call profitable. You need to purify these people enough so that the system keeps running, but ensure they return to your factory in their next incarnation. Finding this balance is exactly what defines a high-scoring game and separates those who are just playing around from those who truly understood the game's meta. You need to surgically calculate the number of heroes you will create just to fund your research, while condemning the rest of civilization to keep sinning on purpose to feed your coffers. When you master this bizarre balance between purity and continuous profit, your resource machine reaches an absurd level of efficiency and the campaign takes off. When we start setting up our infrastructure, the Omnisin building seems like the perfect solution to all problems. In my first campaigns, I filled the map with these general clinics because they treat a bit of everything and are cheap. It's a very tempting comfort zone in the early hours of the game, but as time passes and the city grows, we discover that trying to do everything with a basic structure ends up completely stifling our operation. The real reality check happens when the deviants start to appear. These are those souls that have passed the 50-point mark in a single sin category, coming from the overworld with an absurdly focused load. I remember staring at my screen in frustration because my Omnisin buildings simply couldn't handle them. Since the corruption is extremely concentrated, general treatment isn't enough, and these super valuable souls end up jamming the queue and messing up the entire flow. To solve this chaos, I had to radically change how I expand my city in the underworld. Instead of spreading generic clinics, I started planning entire sectors dedicated to specialists. Setting up buildings focused only on wrath or only on greed requires much more spatial reasoning and a heavier initial investment. However, this is the only way to ensure these high-caliber sinners receive the heavy treatment they need without breaking your factory's rhythm. Nowadays, I see this transition as the major turning point of any campaign. In the late game, you practically live off the profit generated by these specialized structures. Treating deviants stops being a logistical headache and starts being the foundation of your money-making machine. When you finally embrace specialization, your hell stops being an improvised emergency room and transforms into a specialized and frighteningly profitable industry.